Two tweets side by side catch my eye. One from David Peckzek, Peczek. And it's a quote from the great Oscar Wilde from The Soul of Man Under Socialism. It reads, "To recommend thrift to the poor is both grotesque and insulting. It's like advising a man who is starving to eat less." Exactly what Liz Truss, Britain's next Prime Minister in just a couple of weeks' time, actually did today. And the other, cheek by jowl, says Joe Biden's daughter said that her dad showered with her inappropriately. The FBI confirmed it today. This is the sitting president of the United States. How is this not a huge story? Well, it's the first I've heard of it, but my goodness, it ought to be a huge story. Maybe it will become one. Who knows? A bit like Hunter Biden. That was Russian disinformation until it was proven to be true. Now, Lindsey Snell is a distinguished journalist, a very distinguished journalist, a Murrow Award winner who specializes in the very areas that have become the center of world events: the Ukraine, Russia, and the former Soviet states, Soviet satellite states, Russia's near abroad, all of which are powder kegs right at this moment. And I'm very, very glad that Lindsey has agreed to join us now. Lindsey, very nice to meet you. I've been an admirer of your work for a long time, but this is the first time we've had the opportunity to talk. I don't know if you heard my opening monologue, but if not, in précis, the game's up for the war, according to the former head of the British Army, Lord Richard Dannatt, writing of all places in Rupert Murdoch's Times today, in which, inter alia, he says it's time for the Ukrainian generals to tell Zelensky that they can do no more, that this war will have to be brought to a quick end by negotiation and compromise. What do you say to that kind of analysis?
It's absolutely correct. It's hilarious to think that Zelensky isn't fully aware of this, because he is, as he's fully aware of the neo-Nazi issue and the corruption issue. But it's months too late, but it's absolutely necessary. And also there are SPD MEPs, German MEPs, who have said the same thing. It's time to negotiate. It's time to end this.
Well, not just because of the suffering in Ukraine, and we'll of course turn to that in a moment, but the European economies are rapidly going bankrupt and facing, unless I'm a ludicrous optimist, facing widespread civil unrest in their countries. How can people pay 3/4 of their pension on gas and electricity? How can people pay more than half of their income by next April on gas and electricity, whilst food prices are rising rapidly? Nobody can do that. So our own economies are being defuncted by our policy towards this war. Something's got to give, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, this is months too long at this point, but it's time to end it. There are, beyond the economic harm, Ukrainians are dying en masse for no reason. You know, soldiers are underarmed, undersupplied, and they're just being slaughtered. I mean, like 5 soldiers showing 1 AK-74 basically against Russian tanks and artillery. It's just absolutely ridiculous. It's time to end the war.
Do you think the generals, do you think Lord Dannatt's comments today reflects what the generals are telling him? Is the sense that the top brass of the Ukrainian army are close to the point where they'll have to tell Zelensky this?
I think it's been well known for a long time, although there have been reports, some soldiers have said that they told their command that, we can't hold these positions anymore, especially in the Donbass. We can't hold these positions with one rifle and we're just being shelled constantly. And their command said, basically, if you leave, we'll kill you. Sit there. In some cases, they took away some of their weapons for coming in to ask for support and help. So, it might be more beneficial for them to keep the lie going. But I think everyone in Ukraine, including Zelensky, knows it's time to end the war. That there's no chance of militarily winning this.
What would the end of the war look like, Lindsey? It goes without saying, although a surprising number of people haven't grasped this, that what the end of the war would have looked like before the war began is very different to what the end of the war looks like 6 months into it.
It's negotiations and it's, probable territorial divide. And there's no way around that at this point because Ukraine has lost so much territory and they're steadily losing more territory. So, it's just a question of how much more territory will they lose before negotiations are forced and a war, an end is reached.
But how much territory, what territory is likely to have to be ceded by Kiev in order to bring the fighting to an end?
A lot of the soldiers in Donbass think that Kiev has already given up on Donbass, and that's part of the reason that they're so underarmed and undersupplied. They're just sort of sitting there waiting to lose territory, waiting to die, or they think that that's already basically been ceded. So there's a good chance that will be ceded.
And right up to the River Dnieper and right down to the Black Sea coast?
That remains to be seen. But the longer this goes on, more territory will be absorbed by Russia.
And what about the continuation in office of Zelensky? It's very hard to see how Russia could coexist with the current regime in Kiev. Maybe these generals will have to come to power themselves.
Yeah, it's really hard to see. Also, there's a huge divide. Much of the Ukrainian military, especially the far right factions, of which there are many, and they're among the most powerful, really despise Zelensky and don't want to follow his orders anyway. So it's really hard to see how Zelensky factors into the end.
And what's the impact in Ukraine's near abroad, Lindsey? What's the impact on Poland, for example, which of course has long had territorial ambition in Western Ukraine, indeed had sovereignty in Western Ukraine for 150 years. What's the impact on the Baltic states? How much radicalized have these Baltic states become?
The Baltic states have become absolutely insanely radicalized. And you can look at Latvia for chief examples of this, really rapidly outlawing the Russian language in schools, and 15% of people in Latvia are Russian speaking exclusively. They've threatened to pull the passports and render stateless people who express what they deem to be support for Russia. And this is common in many of the Baltic states. It's really, they've legitimized Russophobia. It's become completely acceptable.
Well, the United Nations has demanded a halt to the destruction of historic war memorials pending review. Latvia has gone on what can only be described as a wrecking spree of memorials to the people who fell under Nazi occupation and during the liberation of Latvia from that Nazi occupation.
Yeah, and this is something that they've waited to do for a long time. So it's not like these are just ideas that occurred to them because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is something that they've been waiting to do for a long time. And not only that, they still have, it's legal for them to do the SS Waffen Memorial Parade every year. That's still completely legal. But if you were to carry a Russian flag to a Soviet monument, or even go and try to lay flowers at a Soviet monument, this is now a crime in Latvia. So it's quite a crazy situation.
And what about in Russia itself? Putin's approval rating, at least according to local opinion polls, I suppose they could be questioned, but it seems undoubted that Putin's approval ratings are likely to be in the range that the polls show, which is 82% approval.
I think certainly the Russian population is tired of the war, and the Russian population wants the war to end. It causes, additional complications for the average Russian, especially in terms of we're seeing with travel in the EU now. And I don't think that there's any chance that Schengen visas will be completely banned for Russians, but it's becoming more complicated and more difficult to travel for Russians. And of course, the banking issues. I think the average Russian is very tired of the war and wants it to end, but still completely supports Putin.
Of course, the average Russian doesn't travel to the European Union nor shop in some of the ritzier Western shops that have closed in Moscow. The average Russian doesn't have a yacht and doesn't holiday on the Riviera. It's undoubtedly true that the oligarchs have every reason to be angry about the extent to which they have been effectively robbed by Western countries, legalized theft of their resources. Is that likely to become a factor in Russian politics?
It may, but it hasn't thus far. And I mean, even countries that were particularly friendly to Russia, like Montenegro, have started seizing assets too. So I think it really depends on how far it goes and how long this continues.
Well, I just heard yesterday that West Africa is now the port of choice of the Russian oligarchs. I'm not sure why or how much they'll enjoy it in West Africa, but any port in a storm, I suppose.
Interesting.
Lindsey Snell, thanks for joining us on the Mother of All Talk Show.